Welcome back. I'm Ruth Ann, and this is For Those Who Care. Today's episode explores the art of memoir writing, how we turn our own stories and memories into something that connects writer with reader. Anyone interested in writing a memoir will get something out of today's conversation, but a lot of my questions are geared more towards caregiving because that's what this podcast is all about. My guest today is Maureen Stanton, award-winning author and creative writing teacher. You may remember her from season 1, episode 40, where we talked about her caregiving memoir, The Murmur of Everything Moving. Maureen, thank you for joining us again today. It's so good to see you.
Ruth Ann, I'm so happy to be here and talk about memoir and be on your wonderful podcast. Great to see you too.
Well, let's start with what drew you to teaching memoir, and can you explain the differences between autobiography and memoir? Because even I had a hard time answering that question when someone asked me that recently.
So I'll take that one first because that's the easiest. Autobiography tends to be the story of one's whole life from birth to death. And the tradition of autobiography goes back to the fourth century. And it's really been a tradition of great men writing their lives. And they start with, their grandparents and their birth and their whole life. So that, is kind of an arc of a story of one's life. Memoir is really, it comes from, of course, the French word for memory, can cover a small section of one's life. So, for example, Mary Karr has 3 memoirs. The writer Dani Shapiro has 5 memoirs. Mary Karr's memoirs are her early childhood, which is called The Liars Club. It was a bestseller. Her memoir of teenhood is called Cherry, about being a teenager, and her memoir later in life about overcoming alcoholism and finding Christian faith is called Lit. And so she has 3. Dani Shapiro has 5. You can take, and I have 2. I have one about my teenage years, the coming of age, and I have the caregiving memoir with Steve. And right now I'm working on kind of a memoir, maybe more a collection of essays. The two kind of link. It's all about personal stories, but about taking care of my mom who has Alzheimer's. So it covers a short period of your life. It could be a travel memoir, could just be a journey. Could be your early years. Coming of age memoirs are very popular because really we all come of age, and it's something that's very universal. And they can be fun and funny, even if they're sad and challenging. So that's the basic difference of memoir. How I got into memoir when I was in college and taking creative writing classes in the early 80s, um, there they weren't teaching essay, and there was no term called creative nonfiction, and they weren't teaching memoir. So by the time that I was writing about Steve, I started out writing a short story because that's what I had been trained as in fiction. And after I read it, I was appalled that I had changed some things for the story. I felt like I was betraying his story and my story, and I stripped everything away. And so I started just writing these true stories. And I took it to a writing group that I was just a living room group of writers. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I said, I'm writing these things. They're stories, but they're true. What are they? And there was a man in that group named Michael Steinberg who said, well, you're writing creative nonfiction. You're writing memoir. So that was when I was 30 and I'd already published some humor articles and some pieces that I didn't quite know what to call them, but they got published anyway. I was actually sending them out as short stories to literary magazines, even though they were perfectly true things, that happened with Steve. So it really was taking care of Steve and going through that life-changing experience that made me a memoir writer, that made me understand that I could just tell my story as a true story using literary techniques to make it interesting to other people. And from that point on, I never looked back. I do have some little screenplay and fiction things in the drawers, but mostly I have written and studied and taught memoir and essay writing for now, I guess over 30 years. So I've published my first memoir piece when I was 30 in 1990. So it's been quite some time that I've been really focusing on memoir.
And I would like to say, I did mention our episode. So if anyone's interested in watching that, where you talk about your memoir about Steve, it's a great book too, if you
Thank
want
you.
to read it.
Thank you so much.
Well, when you're teaching memoir, how do you help writers find the central theme that turns their life stories into a cohesive memoir?
So that I often think that writers start writing, and this is true for me too, and I see it in my students. They don't quite know what their theme is or what they're writing about. They're just writing out of some inner kind of desire to explore something, some itch, something they've got to tell. And for me, the theme, sort of that thematic through line that holds everything together, comes later because writing is discovery and writing is thinking. So as you're writing, you realize at some point, and it's often later in the stage of writing, well, what am I writing about? So, for example, when I was writing my memoir of taking care of Steve, for the longest time, I thought it was an illness memoir, that the illness itself and what was happening to the body was the important story there. And it took me quite some time to realize it was a love story. It's a question of how our love changed when faced with mortality, when faced with these challenges. And of course, we went through all kinds of stages from the passionate young love. When we met, I was 24 and he was 29, how old was he? 20, 28. To like when he was dying, and I felt like we were an old couple, that'd been together for years and years, even though that wasn't true. So I think that I found out that much later, and it's a similar thing happened with my memoir of coming of age. So my memoir, Body Leaping Backward, is about my teenage years, and I kind of, after my parents' divorce, I went off the rails, and I got into trouble, and I got into drugs, and then of course I did recover. Um, and I knew I wanted to write about that story because I had done things that really violated sort of the moral upbringing that I had. And I questioned, why did I do that? Why did that happen? And finally, it wasn't until I had written much of it and I was talking to an editor who wanted to uh, give me a contract for publishing the book. And I had to figure out, how do I frame this? What's not the elevator pitch so much, but the summary, the synopsis. And I realized that I was writing about a moral education. And once I figured out that was the theme, then I could choose what to keep and what to cut out of the book. So, excuse me. So I kept things like my Catholic upbringing and how our parents disciplined us and taught us right from wrong and good and bad. And there was a prison in my town, and there was like supposedly this line of the bad people are in there and the good people are out here, which of course was, I challenged that. But I really didn't understand that that was the whole arc of it, is how to return to a moral center after straying from that and doing things that I was really quite ashamed of, actually. So it comes later. And so often with students, they're writing something, and I will say to them, I think this is your story. And they get it then because they are writing about it intuitively. They just don't understand that larger undercurrent of story, the subtext.
And I think a lot of times we're too close to it ourselves. And sometimes it does take having someone else look at it to help you find what the theme is. Do you find that well?
Yes, that is absolutely accurate. We're so close to it, it's the forest through the trees. And if you don't have someone else to sort of look at your work, sometimes just taking a couple of weeks or even months off, you come back to it with fresh eyes and you can kind of see that you have some narrative distance. But oftentimes it's someone else that will tell you. And, I do this a lot with my students, and, they'll say, well, for example, I had a student write about just losing her faith and it wasn't really about losing her faith. I think she was brought up, raised Catholic. She wasn't just losing her faith necessarily, but it was a rift from her family. So in order to be her own self and figure out her own beliefs, she had to leave behind her family. And that is a coming of age. That's part of coming of age. But she would, it's the thing that makes it universal, because we all, in some ways, when we move into our own lives and selves, sometimes we have to leave behind our families. Richard Rodriguez, who's a wonderful writer, wrote about this, and I think his book is called Brown. Um, his parents are Mexican immigrants. He is writing from California, and he ended up getting a PhD. And in order for him, there came a point where he could no longer really talk to his parents in the way that he used to because they weren't educated and the English wasn't their first language. And so he left them behind. And that's a huge loss in order for him to gain his dreams. So I can see that. I can see the sort of subtext, that theme that's under the undercurrent of the book, because it's not me. And because I'm sort of trained to see that as well. So I did some book doctoring when I was freelance writing before I got my academic job. And oftentimes that's what I did is I said, here's your story. This is the universal story that your personal details are connecting to. So I think your story, if I could say, I think your story is a love story. I also think it's a coming of age story in some ways, coming into adulthood in a way that most 20-year-olds do not, and how to deal with that. So, that's why I think you're coming back and returning to some of those accomplishments that you started in your 20s before you became a caregiver, getting a college degree, looking at your art and your photography. Those are things, that's the continuation of your coming of age, those dreams you had for your life before those dreams got interrupted. But it's also a love story. So it has two themes. It's a deep love story.
So really for me, it's still a coming of age story because I'm in the process of what I started in my 20s.
Mhm. And it's interrupted coming of age, just like many people have an interrupted childhood and they have to, go back and finish that. So yeah, so it's easy for others to see, and for writers who are just starting out, you can get that information, say, from a writing group, again, from your own self, if you give it some time and distance from your narrative that your first draft say. You can hire a teacher, a writer, a book doctor, a development editor, who can sort of help you figure out what is the story here you're trying to tell from all the details and scenes and memories that you're putting on the page.
So for someone who's interested in joining a writing group or maybe even starting a writing group, if you can't
Mhm.
find one, what would you look for if you're wanting to write a memoir?
So I would look for other people that are working in nonfiction. It's not all that helpful to have poets. I mean, it's great to read poetry and to read fiction and to learn the skills of those particular genres. Like poetic techniques can be brought into memoir writing, fiction techniques can be brought into memoir writing. But if you're writing your memoir, it's probably good to be around other nonfiction writers. They will get what you're trying to do. And so you can, lots of times local libraries will have writing groups. Sometimes bookstores, independent bookstores will have writing groups. You can look online. A lot of times cities will have writing centers. I know there's a great one in Minneapolis. There's a great one in Boston. It's called Grub Street. They have tons of classes, and you don't have to be from Boston because a lot of those classes are online, and they're all taught by professional published writers. So there's lots of ways you can do this. You don't have to go back to school and get a degree, but you can take, like what I did before I got my MFA and went back to school to take myself seriously as a writer. I just did these week-long conferences that anyone can sign up for. And you're there with other people like yourself, like say it's a memoir, autobiography class or creative nonfiction class, and you're with other people of all ages, from 20s to 80s, and you're all writing your work and you're doing a typical workshop. It's just that it's only a week, but that's a great start. So I did that in Stone Coast at Maine. I did that in Iowa, the Iowa writers. Um, and I also took adult ed courses. So the adult ed courses, which cost really nothing, they're very cheap. They can be really, really good to get that start in writing. And the adult ed class that I took introduced me to the person who then had a living room group that told me, you're writing creative nonfiction, you're writing memoir, which I didn't really know what I was doing. And then I met another person in the group that, we went to one of the Iowa workshop, the summer workshop for a week. We went there together. So I think there's lots of ways for beginner writers to go out and find, kindred spirits and writers working on, but I do think that sticking with the genre of memoir and creative nonfiction is probably more useful.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about what kinds of things you would get out of being part of a writing group, because I've never been a part of a writing group. But one of the benefits that I could see, and tell me if this is correct, is that you're getting people to read whatever you've written before you put it out there into the world. And you can get a lot of great feedback from that, good or bad, to help you perfect your writing.
And that's really true, because as we were just saying, you're so close to your own writing, you can't see. And I mean, this even happens to me too. I tell my students, well, you've got to give some portraiture. We need to see the person you're talking about. We need to have a sense of their felt presence, in your scene. And then I go back to my own writing. I'm like, I don't even do that in my writing. I need to take my own advice and remember that I need to go through some portraiture here. I need to add some setting details. People like to be situated in place. So you can get that. But one thing that's really valuable is not just receiving the feedback from others about your own work, but looking at others' work and figuring out what's working and not working in their work. That's why the workshop method is really, really useful because, and I tell this to my students, I said, your learning is going to come from reading others' work and figuring out why is this working? What are they doing? What choices has that writer made to make this so gripping? Why is this not working? How come I'm not interested or connecting with this section? And when you figure that out, eventually you transfer those craft skills to your own writing. But it's much easier to do it with other. It's like seeing the flaw in someone else, someone else before yourself. It's seeing someone's writing and practicing that work of analyzing the craft that helps you solidify and hone your own craft. So it's a two-way thing. You get the comments from others that can be very valuable, and then you practice, you know, um, the analysis of craft by looking at others, and then you transfer that to your own writing.
So it sounds like an effective writer is also going to be an avid reader.
Exactly, exactly. If you're reading great writing, and it's not that it comes through, osmosis, but you begin to just intuitively understand what a great sentence looks like, or what a gripping moment or scene looks like. The better, if you're reading great writing, you are absorbing that. If you're reading, I like to think of it as like if you're eating a lot of McDonald's, that's going to have an effect on your body. If you're eating really healthy, great, rich food, that's going to have an effect on your body. And it's the same with your mind. If you're feeding your mind really great literature, and it's harder and harder to read these days because we're so distracted. Everything's on screen. We tend to skim everything, and these are actually researched facts, the skimming. This is one of the reasons why I produce a course pack for my students of hard copy readings, because I know that they are going to retain and think about that reading differently than if I put it online and they skim through it. When I do that, I find they can't answer questions I ask about the piece. But when I give it to them in hard copy, they can highlight, they can write notes. It's much more engaging, and they actually, studies have shown, retain much more. So, do yourself a favor, read books, read essays, read good, solid writing, really quality writing. And that's part of your education. Not only the pleasure of it, if it's a great book, but it's part of your education.
Well, what are some of the common misconceptions people have about what a memoir should be?
I think there's a lot of people, and I've heard this myself, is that, oh, you already, in fact, I heard this recently with my most recent book, and a radio interviewer said, oh, isn't just memoir telling your story. It's not, it's easy to write. You're just telling, you already know what happened. You're telling your story. And I think there's a lot of people think that memoir is just simply writing down what happened. And it's not that at all. It's far more complicated because most people are coming to memoir with some distance from the events, and you're a different person. And so the act of writing memoir and the purpose of it is to go back to those events with the kind of maturity and wisdom and distance, that you have gained over that time, and sort of add that reflection and that meaning to those events. So there are times when simply writing down the events is important for the historical record. So those would be Holocaust memoirs, like Elie Wiesel, Night, which most people read in high school. It's simply an account of what happened step by step. That is very important as a historical record. But for most of us, writing our memoirs, illness or caregiving or love stories, there are millions of them because there's millions and millions of us. And so we have to figure out how to make that interesting to other people. Um, and so what we're looking for is not so much what happened in memoir, because we know that the writer knows what happened. So it's not like, oh, what's going to happen next? It's not about suspense. We know the writer knows that. It's about the writer making sense of what happened. The writer looking back and saying, now I know. Now I know why I did this. Now I know how this affected me. Now I know how I survived. And so readers will get something out of that. What they're looking for in really good memoir is for the writer at the desk to be grappling honestly and in a complicated way with the things that happened to them when they were younger. And the reason is this is more difficult than people think. When people say, oh, it's easy to write memoir, you just write down what happened, is because you're dealing with two consciousnesses. It's the dual consciousness. You have to go back and recreate who you were and figure out, how to tell that part of the story. And then you have to you're looking at your younger self And you have to engage with that younger self, and you have to reconcile and maybe come to some uncomfortable, discoveries of things. Um, and so that's the interesting part of memoir is it's a very intimate form. It's a conversation too with readers. You're letting them into your life. You owe them an honest and complicated examination of your experience, not just here's what happened for the sensational part of it.
So it sounds like it's really a lot about growth and how you've grown through this experience.
That's right. It's exactly right. I mean, if you're just writing down, things that you say, for example, um, in my coming of age memoir, I'm just writing down I did drugs and I skipped school and I did some petty crimes and things like that, that the teenagers that are not in control of themselves do. Um, that would just be, it wouldn't be very interesting, I don't think. But it's in looking back at it, I had to really examine who was I and what were those influences? Why did I do that? Out of the seven, I have, six siblings. Why was I the one that did this, that did these destructive, self-destructive things, harmed myself, harmed other people? And how did I stop doing that? And that took a lot of thinking, and it took a lot of reconciling. It took addressing shame. It took forgiving myself. And those are things that I wrote that book 40 years after it happened. I had my diaries and everything to sort of bring me back to the moments, but that's the story, really. That's the story that people want to know is, um, how did you change your life? How did you recover? What did you do? How did that affect you? Who did you become? And how did that imprint of those early years stay with you, of that experience stay with you and shape you?
Mhm. And I think that's why, um, as I'm thinking about caregiving memoir, that's so important because there are so many caregivers out there. And I think you've said that you really haven't found very many caregiving memoirs that actually tell the story where the writer is writing for understanding of themselves. And then the reader also gets to experience that understanding in a way that helps, if they're a caregiver, helps them understand their own selves.
So yeah, so people come to at first there aren't that many caregiving memoirs. I had to look in writing about my mother and her Alzheimer's. I created a proposal for my agent to take out. I'm still working on it. I had to do some revisions, but I had to find similar books. And there just aren't that many, and that's not just caregiving of an elderly person or dementia. It's caregiving overall. And I looked at all the hundreds of books that I put on Goodreads with my little ratings and everything. And I found one that's an actual caregiver memoir. And I'm not saying that's all that exists. I know there's more out there, but there's not a lot and there's not enough. It doesn't reflect the actuality of the number of caregivers, the majority of whom are women, taking care of other women, in some cases, of their mothers, with dementia. Um, and so we need these stories. So there's lots of how-to and a lot of guides and things like that that people can go to. But I find that when you have a story, it's far more penetrating. When you are brought into those moments, there's a couple things that books like that can do. One is that it can validate a person who's going through that and say, okay, I've been feeling ashamed and guilty because I'm angry at this person I'm taking care of because they're treating me badly or whatever. Um, that's validation. Oh, this is the way it is. This is normal. For people who don't have that experience, it brings them into a world so that they can be more sympathetic and empathetic to people going through that. I feel like, a lot of times the way our public policy is set up has to do with individual experiences and people, like sometimes, like especially our elected officials, they'll enact legislation because it's something they experienced, right? So they lost a child or they did this or they need, so that's why we need a diversity in our political body, but also the stories that we tell can help shape the way our culture handles caregiving. And we know we need more support for caregivers, especially caregivers of the elderly right now. We need support for parents caregiving of young children, and that's starting to come about, but we need support for people caregiving the elderly. There are so many baby boomers who are going to have dementia. Um, Even though the percentage of cases of dementia are being reduced from awareness, because of the baby boomers. The case number is going to be enormous. I mean, just the beginning of the baby boomers are into that age now of being 80 or, having dementia. Something like 50% of people over the age of 80 have some kind of dementia. And so the caregiving is not there, the structure is not there, the support is not there. And, for anyone caregiving, we do a lot of free labor. It takes a huge toll, as you know, on your finances, on your emotions, on your quality of life, on everything. So it's kind of a hidden labor and a hidden thing that we do, and there should be more support for it. And I do think that more and more memoirs showing the daily life of a caregiver can bring people into those stories and understand the real challenges. It's complicated caregiving. It's an act of love, but it also can be very challenging and difficult in so many ways. And I think more memoirs of caregiving will be coming out as there are more caregivers, and they're necessary. So for people going through it, it helps them. For people just starting out, it provides them a story. For people who have no experience whatsoever, I love memoirs that take me into worlds and lives that I haven't experienced because it expands my perspective of the world and it helps me exercise my muscles of empathy. I don't know what it's like to take care of a child who had cerebral palsy, but if I read Marianne Leone's Jessie, A Mother's Story, I'm deeply moved and I understand now, what someone goes through when they have a child who doesn't fit into the sort of normal, idea of childhood, and the teasing and the poor medical advice and the misunderstandings that, oh, because their body doesn't function, their mind doesn't function. Her child was brilliant, but everyone thought because he had MS and was, couldn't do much, was bound to a wheelchair, that they should be just locked away or something, they didn't have a personality and a mind. So I think it's a very valuable uh, story to tell and to tell now, and memoir is a great form for it.
Well, how do you encourage writers to handle the emotional weight of revisiting some of those painful memories, especially caregiving?
That is a really, really good question. And it does come up even when I'm teaching my undergraduates. They're young, but they have their childhoods that they're writing about. Um, you will experience you'll experience the emotions again. When memories surface up, they are attached. The emotions that happened at the time still are sort of glued to those memories. Those memories evoke the same emotions. And so you have to be ready to re-experience that, and which means you have to be ready to write your memoir. You have to be ready to sink back into those times. And sometimes that's why memoir, I think a lot of memoirs wait a long time because they have to have that emotional distance to go back and look at it. So for example, when I was first writing the memoir about Steve, it was about 10 years after he died. I had written some little pieces in between then, but in graduate school, 10 years later, I decided to write the book and I sunk back into it. I looked at 1,000 pages of medical records. I looked at my journals. I cried every day that I wrote that first draft, which was probably a year. And I probably wrote 5 days a week because I was in graduate school and I had the time to write. Um, but once the story was really roughly and messily put on the page, but fully put on the page, and all that crying and that catharsis and that revisiting, um, and then maybe even some purging, that happened emotionally while I was writing that, now was also had left me. And I could step back and I could look at that story from the perspective of a writer and say, okay, this is a story. Now I need to do these things to make it a compelling and beautiful story. I couldn't have done that at the first pass. I wasn't worried about, oh, the metaphors or what goes where, how to say this. I simply poured it onto the page. And that was really quite cathartic. It was grieving all over again, but in kind of a clean way. I definitely grieved. I still, even now, all these years later, when I'm choosing what I might read from that book, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to read that because I don't want to cry in front of this audience in the bookstore. Um, it's still there. It's still in you. But when you tell the story, you're going to experience some of that sadness and pain. Um, but not in a bad way, I don't think. And if it's too much, you just step back and you come back at it later. One thing that I also experienced when I was writing my memoir of coming of age, which is 40 years after it happened, I was looking at my diaries, and that was the year that I really fell off, my trajectory of being a good student and being a cheerleader and being on teams and sports into just drugs and skipping school and doing, stupid self-destructive stuff. It was the year of 16 to 17 years old, 15 to 17, around there. And when I read that diary, and it was in the summer, so I didn't have to teach and I could avoid people for days at a time, I descended back into my teenage self so powerfully from reading that diary that I felt what it was like to be the teenager I was at the time. I felt awkward. I felt self-conscious. I didn't like myself. I felt so bad. And then it passed. I couldn't go out. I couldn't face people. And that lasted about 2 days because I was just reading that one little diary. And then I came and I was like, oh, okay. But it was really weird to have immersed myself back then and think about how awful I felt as a teenager for a little bit. Um, but then I could get that power of those feelings on the page because I re-experienced it. I could recreate it on the page in a way that was very powerful and very authentic. But it was uncomfortable. It was really uncomfortable. It was it was kind of like, oh no, I'm back here again and being 16 and awkward and self-conscious and oh.
Sounds like we need to get uncomfortable. Actually, it sounds like we need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable when we're writing our own stories.
I think so, because if you touch that authenticity, so I think it was Robert Frost, I'm hoping it's Robert Frost, the poet, that said, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. So if you're not moved and emotionally moved and feeling your own story, it's going to be very hard to authentically and powerfully recreate that on the page. Um, in fact, without my diaries, I don't know if I could have even written that book. And now early writings in college, I had written some stuff in college and I had these little amateur short stories and things, but those were true stories. And I was able to incorporate some of that in the book and it jogged my memories in a powerful way as well. But yeah, it's, and this is what makes memoirs moving, is that people feel those things as well. Just like in a novel, when you're transported into a world that the writer is creating, when you're reading a memoir, you're transported into someone's real life. I've cried at memoirs. I've laughed. Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. I cried. I laughed like hell because some of it's funny. And then I just sobbed. And for me, that's the best experience of a book, 'cause I feel very connected to a person and I feel so human and so moved in the best way by writing and by art and by someone's story of survival, of the wisdom they gained. It's really it can be quite a powerful experience.
What techniques do you find most effective for memoirs that center around personal caregiving journeys?
So just to make the memoir powerful, you have to make the people real. Um, when people read memoirs, they want to connect. We read for the people, not the story. And so we want to connect with the people. And so you have to portray them. In fiction, you do character development and you'd have this huge list of character traits and dreams and hopes of your character and their physical, presence and their gestures. You have to do that with real people as well. Um, when to come to know somebody on the page through really in-depth portraiture is to come to love them or care about them. Sometimes it's to come to hate them if it's appropriate. But so I think of James Baldwin and when he wrote Notes of a Native Son, which is a long essay and part of a book that has the same title of other essays. And he's writing about his father's death and he's writing about hate. He hated his father. Um, he has a full, and it's probably a 20-page piece. It's beautifully written. I've taught it for years, and every time I teach it, the 20th, 30th time I've read it, I'm moved to tears and I'm amazed by his writing. Um, and so he writes about his father and he does this study of his father in a way that's mature, that's balanced, even though he hated his father, it's through the lens of honesty and affection. And what bothers him so much is he sees the traits of his father that he most dislikes coming into himself. And so he's writing this in the context of racism in the 1950s, post-World War II, and realizing that in the end, he discovers that the hate that you carry is going to eat you away. The hate that white people have for black people, and the black people rage and anger and hate that he felt for white people, and that he felt for his father, who sort of succumbed a little bit to being afraid, to his fear of white people. Um, so the techniques, so portraiture is a huge issue. Um, you really have to bring the person, and this is ironic in a way, the person, say, who died, you have to bring them to life on the page. The reader will care about them. And then when they pass, the reader is moved and feels like there's a loss, in the world. It's not the depth of your loss, obviously, or my loss, but it's the depth of a loss of somebody who was very real, that they could connect to, as very human. So three-dimensional portraiture is important. And you do that through, I mean, obviously you start out with the physical portraiture, but then everybody has ways of speaking. They have a felt presence in a room. They have a biography. Did they come from a working class family, a privileged family? Did they come from the Midwest? They come from the Northeast. All those things make up who we are, those complicated things. And so the more that you can get of that on the page, the more that the reader comes to know who it is you're writing about. And that's yourself usually, but you also have another subject, say that's the person you're caring about. So you've got to show them, and you've got to show them honesty. Honestly, if it's hagiography, if you're making them all perfect, and readers are going to see through that, because they know that none of us, we're all more complicated than that. We all have our foibles and our flaws. So writing about people honestly, um, and you do that through portraiture, but also you can do that through scenes, showing how they act, how they react. How does someone react to pain? How does someone react, to loss? How does someone react to, a doctor's, flippant comment or something? And that tells us who we are, or who we are in that moment, or how we're coping with that. Sometimes it's setting. So, for example, every object you have in your house tells us something about who you are. Um, the kind of house you have, those things they show your values. I see beautiful art on your walls, I see plants. And those things are part of who you are, because you choose those things based on your likes and your interests. So all of those things go into creating portraiture. So that's one technique. Scenes, and this is all borrowing now from fiction writers. So if you read a great novel, you know that there's a depth of character creation. The character has motives, they have a backstory, they have complications, they have an interiority, and then they have the actions they take. There's also scenes in, what moves a movie or a novel forward is scene after scene after scene. And in scenes, things happen and things change. So you have to know when to use a scene and when to pull back. If you think about it as a camera, there's this zooming close in and there's the pulling back out. And the pulling back out is when you're giving background and you're explaining what's happening. And then you zoom into a moment. And maybe it's a moment in the hospital, a vulnerable moment, or maybe it's a tender moment between two people. Usually you choose scenes when something changes. So you have the arc of your story, and in that arc, there's pivotal changes. So when Steve, for example, um, moved into an anger phase, uh, I showed the scene of me bringing him dinner and his reaction, because he couldn't taste it. The chemotherapy had killed his taste buds, and he was frustrated and angry. And he took his arm and he swept the plate off the coffee table, and it went flying into the room and bounced off the wall. And I'm sobbing and I'm trying to clean up little fish pieces off the carpet in the living room. And, so I had to bring people into that moment to show that. If I simply said, he was very angry and he, threw his dish, I really showed those details. And that makes it much more powerful. But that was a scene where things had changed, our relationship changed, and then pull back out, give more of the story, move the story forward, move in for another scene. Maybe it's a scene when he's taking an experimental treatment and it's very scary. And what the doctors are doing, they're wrapping him up in bandages. They're, raising his temperature to 107. He had whole body hypothermia. So I'm bringing people into those moments so they can feel the fear that I felt, the trepidation, and in some ways the bravery of him going through that dangerous experimental. I mean, people have died in that treatment. Um, and So you choose when to zoom in and when to zoom out. And those are tools of the novelist, and novelists do that all the time. Um, and then, tools of the poet are just beautiful language, metaphors, lyrical language, images that serve symbolically. Um, the example I use for my students is like when you see a story of war reporting, oftentimes they're not showing, a pile of bodies, but they're showing, say, a burned out building and a child's shoe or a little doll head or something like that. And they choose those images because they're symbolic and metaphorical. We see what's been lost without having to be too close into sort of the gory details. So that's the sort of lyrical part and the poetic part of writing.
As you were talking, I kind of latched on to you talking about the little bit of fish pieces that you
Mhm.
were picking up. So, how can the sensory detail or the scene building help readers connect with an experience that may be deeply personal to you?
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting you said the fish pieces because that is a concrete detail and one that people can imagine in their head and they can almost feel it. So, one of the things that I share with my students is there's been studies using functional MRIs where subjects go into the MRI and in live time they're reading literary works and versus they're reading, say, a newspaper article or some other nonfiction text or something like that. And what happens in their brains is vastly different. So when they're reading just a newspaper article, it's kind of the frontal cortex, figuring out things out. When they're reading a really great, powerful scene from a novel, their brain is firing in all different directions. When they're reading about cutting a lemon, the olfactory part of the brain that helps us smell basically and process smells is lighting up. There's neuronal activity. When someone's pulling, a light switch or opening a doorknob or feeling a leather coat, they're smelling the leather, they're feeling it, they're tactile. It's all different parts of the brain that control that. And so what happens is people use those sensory details, and as you're reading, they begin to create that film strip in their mind. So your imagination takes the sensory details and creates a movie, from these black and white words on the page. So if I say, somebody was riding a purple banana bike, right? It's better than saying they're riding a bike because then it's just riding a bike. It doesn't really, but when you say purple banana bike with tassels, and cards clothespined on the spokes, you immediately get a detailed picture. Maybe you had a bike like this, or maybe you've seen one, and then you're in that image in your mind. So I call it literary transference, where the reader enters the story because the story has entered the reader neurologically, literally entered their brain.
As as you were saying that, I heard the cards in the spokes of the bicycle.
And those, it's amazing the kinds of details do so much power to evoke images and stories. And so I'm always telling my students really often, the general is good for background, but if you're writing in a general way, it's just going to kind of fly over people. It's going to glance off them. It's not going to really penetrate. But if you're saying, if you're writing about walking out in the woods and there's a fir tree with the little fir needles coming out, and people start seeing them, and that fresh, poignant, not poignant, pungent scent of that, or, I'm just looking at my window and seeing the trees. But if you actually go back and recreate the experience you had. So if you're sitting in the room with your husband, if I'm sitting with Steve, what did the room look like? What were the smells? What did things feel like? What did his bathrobe? I still have Steve's bathrobe. I can't throw it away. I sometimes wear it. Um, what did that feel like? What does the skin feel like? And when you start creating using sensory details to create those images, the reader goes along with you, and they are doing the active work of creating the scene because you're giving them all those clues. And when you write very generally, it just doesn't happen. And studies have shown this. So that's where sensory detail, concrete sensory detail, can be very powerful. Not that you can't sort of give background in a general way, but when you want people to really come into the story, you bring them there, you transport them into the room with you. They can see and feel and hear what you see and feel and hear. You are their guide into that world that you lived in.
one of the questions that I want to ask you is, why do you think that the world needs more caregiving memoirs right now? And you sort of answered that question for me. And it's because in the experience that I lived, it's so hard to describe to somebody what your day-to-day life is like. It's exhausting for one. While you're being a caregiver, it's hard to tell somebody all the details. Well, this is why I'm too tired to go out with you, because of all these things that happened during the last 5 days. It's too much for your brain to process at the time. It's too much for you to tell somebody, and they're probably not going to understand it to the level that you want them to anyway. So when you sit down to write your story, your memoir of your caregiving years, it's important to add those details in to allow that understanding, because nobody else has walked in your shoes. So if you don't provide those details, you're still not going to you're still not going to find that people understand you if you cannot provide those details that help immerse them in your life.
That's right. I mean, the key word that you used is immerse. So you are immersing them in the day to day, in the morning, I make the breakfast, I give it to Steve, I set up his vitamins, they're in an egg crate. There's 20 pills he has to take because we're trying to save his life through vitamins, and holistically. And then, setting him up with his water and his bell on the coffee table so he can ring it when he needs something. And he's in his black and white checkered bathrobe and his jogging shorts, which are comfortable because everything irritates his skin. And you see that all the little things you do, and then I have to go to work, and at work, what am I doing? And my mind is frozen because I can't stop thinking of Steve. So I'm just arranging pencils because I'm kind of frozen that day. You kind of have to show those really, they seem mundane, but those mundane details make up the story, and show people the challenges. And, so I know, like, my sister's husband had a stroke and he's recovered some, but not completely. And so I know just from, and I think other people maybe not don't know all that she has to do. He can't lift a grocery bag. He can't lift the grandchildren. He can't scrub the house. He can't drive and go shop. All these things now, and I'm sure you know very well, you have to do. And even though they're mundane domestic tasks, there's no one else to do them. And then all the bills and all the medical information and, trying to motivate him to keep doing things to try and heal. And there's so much to it. It's it can be very overwhelming. But a lot of people think, well, you're a caregiver. They don't really know all that demands of people. And I think that if we do have more of these stories, I think people are going to understand caregivers need help. They need help. They need help. They need resources. They need guidance. They need, time off from work. We need facilities that can help. I think people don't really know, like even taking care of my mother, it's like, okay, I gotta make sure she brushes her teeth because she's not remembering this. My mother, who took brilliant care of her beautiful smile, is now not even brushing her teeth. Like, you know what I mean? So we have to remind her, then we have to write big letters on this bottle of scope and please. And if I'm there with her, it's like, okay, go, you didn't brush your teeth, go in and brush. In some ways, like taking care of a child and with dementia who's forgetting their hygiene. Um, but those little details, I think, can show just the very mundane challenges that build up and accrue into an exhausting amount of work, and care and love that you have to take care of, that you have to give to people. They don't always know. And I think if we make it more clear through these powerful stories, we might get somewhere with understanding how, what we need to put in place to help people who are ill, who are old, who need help, and the caregivers who this is falling onto. I do remember when we had hospice. I had a great hospice in Ann Arbor with Steve. Um, they took care of me. They understood. They said, go to bed. You need to sleep right now. You go to bed. Take care of yourself. And my counselor understood. She said, look, you can't just have crackers for dinner. If you were your own child, you wouldn't feed your child crackers for dinner. But you are neglecting yourself because you're taking care of someone else. So something as simple as showing that all you can manage to do is have crackers for dinner, shows the sort of exhaustion of putting all their energy into someone else and neglecting your own physical needs and your own spiritual and psychological needs. And we need more of these stories. And as I said, I just don't think they're there are many out there. And in a way, they're compelling, that compel you to stay with it, because they're not always easy stories to read. Um, Illness, people tend to avoid. They want to avoid that. So, but they are love stories often, and yours is a great love story. And I think that's very, very appealing as well. It shows the best of humanity. It shows what we can give to each other. And it's such a gift. But it also shows, all that it takes of a person to carry someone through the illness and the end of their life.
Well, along those same lines, caregiving often feels um, invisible or overlooked in our culture. How can memoir help shine a light on that?
It's interesting because I've read a lot of illness memoirs, especially in writing my own memoir of illness. And so the focus is often on the person who is suffering the illness, and that's appropriate. But as you said, the caregiver is kind of in the background and invisible. Um, and so so that's something that our culture doesn't want to face, I think, generally. And it's the way that like a lot of people didn't really appreciate the work of mothers, basically. And I think that's coming more into, as we have more awareness of, we need daycare for mothers, we need help for mothers. Mothers are working and they're coming home and doing all the domestic chores, and, you know, husbands need help, whatever, partners need help. We're finding, I think we need to find that level of awareness through about caregiving, because there are going to be more and more caregivers. And when it comes at least to caregiving for seniors, one statistic I read is that 2/3 of the caregivers for dementia patients are women, and 2/3 of the patients are women. So this is women taking care of women. I think it's a feminist issue, but we tend to ignore and neglect or underappreciate the work of women, the domestic work of women. Um, and in fact, when memoir, started becoming very popular. Memoir's been around since the fourth century, but it was really popularized in the, say, 90s, when we started having best-selling memoirs on the New York Times bestseller list instead of novels, or along with novels, I should say. And so it became a time when uh, the memoir or autobiography changed from, oh, you had to have accomplished some great thing in your life. You were an athlete, a politician, a movie star, and they've been writing their memoirs forever. But now, ordinary people, working class people, women, did the domestic sphere, started writing their memoirs. And when women started entering uh, the field of memoir with their domestic stories, there started to be a lot of criticism of memoir. Who cares? I have a whole thing I do on this, because it really irritated me. But the criticism of memoir as it rose in popularity in the, say, 90s and onward, was often focusing on memoirs by women. And I have specific articles I can point to and say, well, there's 10 memoirs referenced in this article criticizing memoir, 9 of them are women, even though more men publish memoirs than women, at least then. Now I think it's probably more equal. But um, so so that's why I think memoir is really important, but also to show the work of women that is underappreciated, that is invisible, that takes a big toll. I know that even caring for Steve took a toll on my own career trajectory, took a toll on me physically, took a toll on me psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. My coming of age memoir, what I went through there, really delayed my career, my development as an adult for quite some time, because I really went off the rails and didn't get the education I wanted. And right now, having to take care of my mother, which is both an act of love, because I deeply love and care for my mother, who was a great mother. I can see that it's affecting my life. I'm not writing very much as I should be. I'm tired. I'm having to do her taxes, and I'm having to do all her business affairs and her medical affairs and make these changes. And so it just takes a toll. It takes a toll on your own life. It's a sacrifice. Even though it's done in love, it's a sacrifice. But it's something that people, I don't think they even know that's going on. In my job, in my life, in my academic life, I have to keep producing and writing and publishing. That's part of my job, teaching and research. And it's very slowed down because of the time that I have. The spare time goes to taking care of my mother. So those are things that need to be understood, so that people can say, well, you're not being productive in your job. Well, there's a reason why I can't get to that. and some understanding of that, and understanding of, so we have family leave, so we have 12, you can get 12 weeks and have some of your salary, but not everybody has that. But I think if we had more access to that, um, it would be easier for people. And I don't think we're going to get there until people understand what's happening. And the understanding comes from telling these stories in detail so that people see what caregiving is all about.
I think the big thing here is that people need to be willing to listen to those stories. As you said in that one article, with 10 authors, 9 of them were women, and people are saying, who cares? People need to care about these stories and
Mhm,
realize that we're all affected by it, whether you're caring for someone directly or not, because you know someone who's caring for someone and that affects your relationship with them, or it affects their work. Whatever it is, caregiving is part of our lives, whether we
mhm,
acknowledge it or not.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely true. Yep. But it is, again, not something that's sort of done on the side and not really focused on.
What cultural or emotional impact do you hope these stories can have on how society views caregivers and care recipients?
Yeah, I really believe that if you get the story out enough, if people start really understanding, I mean, it can do things like change policies. We have people now trying to get childcare. The state of New Mexico, the governor has just made preschool, I think daycare, free for everybody. And that, that helps women. That helps women to be able to work. And afford childcare, which has become so expensive. So elder care, or, care of partners who are ill, or anyone who needs that. We have our idea that, oh, when you're ill, you go to a hospital, or you go to a hospice or rehab or something. But there's this whole part of that takes place in the home. And that's the part that, if we really understand that, uh, maybe Medicare or Medicaid or certain policies for work will change. And it's starting to happen. I think there's, in Maine, where I live, there's, you can deduct some costs of caregiving. It's pretty minor compared to what we might really need, but I think people are starting to understand that we need some support. When Medicare came about in the 60s, they had, these systems for elder care, and they haven't been changed since. They have not been changed since. The budget hasn't changed. The amount of time, what they'll cover, hasn't changed. The recognition of that. It's just, you know, I also think that if there are more and more memoirs, like say yours, maybe it's going to be a movie, and maybe people will see, not just the person who's ill, but the person who's the story of the person who's taking care of that person. And, you know, I see a lot of memoirs about Alzheimer's, and they're generally by people who can afford to put their parent or somebody in a really nice memory care, and it's all set. That's not the case for a lot of people. They can't afford that, or they lose their entire family wealth, like the generational wealth they might pass down. Right now, we are eroding the wealth that my mother might leave us, which is her house. We're borrowing against it to pay for her memory care. Because the facilities they have in nursing homes are awful. They're really awful. I mean, I don't know how people have ever been in a nursing home. I worked in one when I was a teenager, and it was like, wow, this is a shock. And it was a shock to me again when we started looking at them. I thought, it's not dignified, you know? There has to be better, and it's insanely expensive, $16,000 a month, for a shared room that looks like a hospital setting. It's like, we have to do better, for people who've lived their lives, have contributed. My mother was a nurse for 40 years. She took care of people. And now we're finding it hard to have facilities that take good care of her. And I feel like, why as a culture do we think that we don't need to take care of older people the way we want to take care of our children as well? People who are vulnerable, we need to have some resources to take care of people in a way that's dignified. Other countries are getting it. There's other countries that are, some of the Scandinavian countries, they have these dementia villages, and people can come in, and of course paid for because, they have socialized medicine. Um, and it's not like a nursing home bed that's a hospital setting. Like, so the nursing homes we've looked at for my mother, it's a single bed that, kind of on wheels with a curtain in between and some stranger next door who might be, who knows, shrieking all night. Who knows? My dad was in that for a while for rehab. He was so unhappy. It's just not a nice place to be. Linoleum floors, the nursing, these are nursing homes and I think they should be improved. I think there should be some privacy. I think there should be less of a setting of, I mean, if there are settings that are beautiful, but they just simply cost a fortune. So for people that can't afford that, you know, there has to be just a more dignified way of treating not just the elderly, say, that are in the nursing home, dementia patients, but even the nurses' aides. They don't get paid very much. They do a lot of work. They're caring for people. And that should be registered, like we need to give them decent pay. And we need to help families figure out how to take care of their seniors. It used to be that you live in this compound and Granny was up there and you're all, we had these, 100 years ago, we had these families that were all in one place and the young took care of the old. We just need to rethink this whole idea of caregiving, especially for the elderly. And what can we do, um, to help that? I think I heard of one program where college students would go live with elderly people that had a room in their homes. And for free room and board, they might do some errands around the house or a little bit of light caregiving. And those are really good ideas, but they're just starting to come about. We haven't really looked at this for a very long time as a culture. And that's why I think that memoirs and stories can really help people understand what it takes to be a caregiver and who's doing the caregiving and the daily work of that.
Well, you've mentioned several books throughout this conversation, and I'm wondering what books have shaped how you think about telling real life stories.
So one of the books that I think is useful for people is by a writer called Vivian Gornick, and it's called The Situation and the Story. And in that book, this is a craft book. So in that book, she talks about how to write I sometimes call it, instead of the situation, the story, the external journey and the internal journey. And so she really lays out in a very useful way how you're writing the external journey, which is what happened on the ground. We're going to the hospital, we're driving here, we're doing this, I'm giving him his meds. And then the internal journey. And that's the story. She calls the situation external, the story internal. What's really happening, how you're changing, what you're thinking, feeling, what it's doing to you. And then that writer at the desk coming back and looking at that and reprocessing those things from that distance, that narrative distance of time and wisdom gained and maturity. So that's one, Situation, a Story by Vivian Gornick. And there's my advisor in grad school wrote a wonderful book. Let's see, it's Writing Life Stories. I wrote it down. His name is Bill Rohrbach, Roorbach, and it's called Writing Life Stories. And he really, it's such a good book. He takes you through step by step writing a memoir with examples. He's also a very colorful, funny writer. So reading that book, you can use that as a guide. So, okay, now I need to do this. Here's how I get the story. And he has lots of anecdotes and examples. So it's very readable. I tend to not like reading craft things, how to do, but if it's done well, it can be very illuminating. And those two books I think are really, really done well. Stephen King has a good book about writing memoir. Can't remember what it is, but you'll know it's the only book he's written about craft, the horror writer, Stephen King. But it's about, and I vividly remember one moment from that, which is when he had a babysitter who was having a very large woman, like was sitting on him or something. And like, this is how his brain like turned into monsters and horror and fear and loss of control. But so he has lots of anecdotes too to show what made him a writer. I think those stories, those books can be very inspiring and useful for craft. And there's one book that I give to students who really want to write, and it's called The Courage to Write. And it's by Ralph Keyes. I think it's Keyes. I read that book when I started out writing. I read it, and then I turned around, I read it again, and then I started again. It's lots and lots of anecdotes, but what it really shares is writing is scary. Every writer is afraid. It's scary to tell your story. Famous writers are afraid. Famous writers have writer's block. Famous writers write crappy drafts. And so you start feeling like, okay, this is part of the process. I can do this. Famous writer XYZ, had this mental breakdown over trying to, not a tip, an actual diagnosis, but it's like freaking out or being jealous or envious of other writers. All those emotions and the psychology of writing are covered in that book, The Courage to Write. And for me, it's really useful even now because every time I'm finished with a project and I start a new one and face the blank page, I think, I forgot how to write. I don't know how to write. What am I doing? And then I remember, you do, you can write. You know that this part is hard. The blank page is daunting. How do you start? All those questions that I try and teach writers come back for me and resurface as I try again when I start a new project. So that's a really good one to sort of just the psychology, just, the courage to write. It's also very entertaining because it has lots of anecdotes about famous writers, like facing fear and things like that. So those are three really good craft books for memoir and for writing in general. And like I said, there's many, many really great memoirs out there, not a lot on caregiving. There's only one that I could actually recommend. And that was Jesse's story, Marianne Leone. She's an actress. She had a small part in The Sopranos for a recurring part, but she's a wonderful writer. And that book is just heartbreaking and sad and just inspiring. And it is a caregiving. Her child, I think, had cerebral palsy. It is a caregiving memoir, and he did pass away when he was 19. Um, but I just don't have a lot others to recommend. There's lots of cancer memoirs, but they tend to focus on either they're written by the person with cancer or they're not really written by the caregiver. So they're not that useful for caregiving. But there's many good memoirs out there just for examples of memoir. Um, and I think you can just find them, just Google a list of top 50 memoirs and study them, study the craft of them.
Well, after everything that we've discussed, what guidance would you give to someone who wants to start writing their caregiving memoir?
So I think the first step of writing your memoir is to just allow yourself to give yourself permission to write and tell the story. And don't worry about what other people are going to think. Don't worry about if it's ever going to get published. Don't worry about if it's good or not. Simply write and get it out on the page. And whether you have to use a timeline to help you figure and remember, or records or your journals, just write it on the page and don't worry about anything except for getting that story out. Just write intuitively, write the story. It doesn't matter if it's out of time, if things are not chronological. All that revision comes much later. If you start thinking about those things when you're writing the first draft, or what is someone going to be mad that I'm writing this, or, oh, maybe I should write this later. This part goes here. Don't even think about that structure or anything. Just write. Actually another really good book is Bird by Bird by Annie Lamott. She's a writer who's written novels and nonfiction. And she has a chapter that I use in my classes called Shitty First Drafts. And pardon my French, but it's her French. um, and it is permission to write, to just write and not worry. Because, who cares, right? A lot of nonfiction writers have that voice in their head. Oh, who cares? I have to vanquish that voice, even after all these years of writing in this genre. I'm like, who cares about this? Who cares about my mother? Like, why would anyone care? Vanquish all that, just write. There's going to be a pleasure in writing. There's going to be a catharsis. Um, I think it's gonna, if you have enough distance, I think it's gonna feel good to write that story because you're almost witnessing your own experience. There's gonna be a lot of things you forgot that are gonna come bubbling to the surface and like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Or, so just write all that down. The later stages revision. And that you can get help with revision, as we talked about earlier, from writers groups or from anyone, or from even just giving it time, from reading craft books, all that. So that's the main thing, is just give yourself permission to write it. Don't let anything stop you, any editorial voice in there that's saying you shouldn't write this, you can't write this, it's not your story, you're not good enough, no one wants it. Just vanquish those as much as you can. That's the main thing. And then the craft of it comes after. That's probably the second stage. And then the third stage is when you feel like you've got a really good draft and you want to take it out into the world. You think about, how do I get this published? And that's a whole other conversation. There's many avenues to publishing, which I'd be happy to talk about at another time. It's just like too big to cram in now. But there's independent publishers, there's self-publishing, there's mainstream publishing, there's online publishing, Substack. People do it in all different ways now to get their story out there. But that really comes down the line. One of the things is that it does take a long time to write a book. It might take you a couple of years. So you have to be really invested and really passionate about getting the story out, because to sustain that interest in that work, it's like building a house by yourself. It's going to take years, and if you get bored with it, after halfway, you're just going to have a structure that you can't live in. So you have to be compelled enough to stay with it for a long period of time, even if it's just 5 hours a week, for 5 years or whatever. Have never really been able to write full time, so I have to carve out the spaces to write. But it is a project that's going to take some time. Um, but I would encourage anyone, to do it, because we know that life writing can help. It helps with PTSD. It helps process things. It feels good. It is cathartic. It is getting it out so that it doesn't live inside you in this tense way. So whether the book is published or not, or how it's published, don't even worry about that. Just write it, because writing is therapeutic and useful anyway.
And I will say that I journaled throughout the last year of my husband's life because we had him on hospice.
Mhm.
And going back through those journals and reading all of the things I wrote, I want to offer an encouragement to caregivers that even if you don't write your book, your memoir, and have it published, just writing it, getting it on paper, and going back and rereading it. I was so involved in what I was doing, caring for him, and I just kind of wanted to have a record of it. But I was able to feel all of those things all over again, rereading it, and also see just how much I did to take care of him. And it made me feel so good about the job that I did caring for him, especially that last year of his life when he was on hospice. So if you are thinking about writing your story, I hope that that's an encouragement to you.
And I think journaling has many purposes. One is just preserving that, but also processing it as it's happening, a way to sort of try and figure things out. But then revisiting, of course, you can, you forget how much it took and what you did. And I never thought of myself as heroic. And people have read my book and said, "Oh, what you did was," I'm like, "Oh, I didn't want to be sainted for it at all." But it did feel good to realize I did the best I could. I did everything I could for him. I don't think I could have done more. And that there's satisfaction in that. And I don't think I would have really understood that as much if I hadn't revisited, all the hospital notes and all my journal notes and, letters and things like that. And I think I would have maybe not understood the love that was there, that was driving all this. Because we had our problems in our relationship. Um, but what it really came through was the love. And that was really, it makes me feel good.
And as caregivers, we do tend to beat ourselves up too. We always feel like we have to be perfect for some reason, and nobody's perfect. It's so good to look back and
Mhm.
see all the effort that you put in and what a difference you made.
It's also good to acknowledge like the uncomfortable feelings, like I'm angry at him, or I just want to go out and have a beer with my sister. And then the guilt that brought, that kind of thing. So that really was very real to go back and go, this is what I was struggling with. And it's what everyone would struggle with, because you can't, like my counselor at the time would say to me, you've got to keep one foot in the world of the living. You can't just 100%. I would have immersed myself into taking care of Steve. I thought that when he died, I would just go with him. Um, but thank God my counselor forced me once a week to go out for a beer with my sister, and I felt guilty the entire time, but it was something that really helped in the end. And that's something I would have forgot about if I hadn't written it down.
Yeah, I went through a lot of things. I read through a lot of things that I had forgotten too, even 5.5, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to add?
I guess I think that you did have one question on there about what other people are going to think about your memoir. And this is something I have encountered, is that people are afraid to write their memoir because of what their mother will think, or what, others. And I did struggle with that with Steve's family. He had children, he had siblings, and the book came out, and oh, what are they going to think about it? And it wasn't always pleasant. Some of them wished I hadn't written it. but some refused to read it. His daughter did read it. She's now, I think 50 now. And she was good about it. She didn't have the greatest relationship with her dad, but um, and she was really good about it. She was mature and honest, and that felt good. But you can't let those things stop you. As you're writing towards the end of the memoir, if you're done with the writing and you're ready to seek publication, that's the time to think about what you might need to do to protect people's privacy. But don't think about that first, and don't let what other people might think stop you from writing your story, because your story is important.
That's really great advice. Well, for anyone interested in checking out your work, how can they find you?
So I do have a website, maureenstantonwriter.com, and I have some articles and essays. I've written short memoirs, and I have some of those in full that people can read online. Some of them are very short, 1,000 words, 2 pages, and some of them are much longer. So those are available. They can learn about my books. They can read reviews. They can read excerpts of my books. Libraries should carry the book. Probably can get it used now, Um, so I'm more than happy to answer questions. If you want to email me, I do have a contact form on my website, and I get emails quite frequently. I always answer them. And sometimes it's about writing, and sometimes it's just sharing their experience. Um, I had a short piece that was in the New York Times Modern Love column, and I got so many people writing and talking about the loss of their own partner, and even if it wasn't, that the piece moved them, even though it was a short piece, it was really probably 3 pages. Um, and that's on there in full, so people can read that. Um, but yeah, I'm more than open and happy to even converse with people, or if they want to contact.
Well, you mentioned that it would be another conversation to talk about publishing. So someday down the road, I would love to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I teach a literary publishing course, so I really know a lot about, and obviously I published with major presses, I published with university presses, I published, in literary journals and magazines. I've had 3 agents now. So, I mean, that's not atypical to have go through several agents, but so I can really answer a lot of questions about publishing. And I'm always happy to help people learn about that, because there's a mystique, how do you get published? Ooh, and it's not, it can be demystified just through knowing, how to find publishers, how to know what's a good one, how to know how to approach that, how to do a proposal for your book, how to do a query, where to find agents, what's it like publishing with a university press versus trying to get Penguin Press to write your book, to publish your book. So yeah, I'm more than happy to do that.
Well, Maureen, I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I really appreciate you sharing all of this knowledge with everyone. And I look forward to having another conversation sometime in the near future. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you. I've so enjoyed the conversation, and I can't wait for you to start writing your memoir and to read it someday in book form. So,
Well, thanks everyone for listening, and be sure you hit that subscribe button so that you are notified when the next episode is available. I'll see you next time.